Welcome to Learning in Real Time. I'm Melissa, and I'm excited for you to be here for my third episode. And what's been on my mind lately, what I've been learning, some thoughts that I have on what I've been thinking about this week. So towards the end of my last episode, I briefly mentioned failure. And that's something that's really been on my mind lately. I've been thinking about what failure actually means. I've been thinking and talking about taking your first step, starting before you're ready. And I've done that with several things lately, like my podcast I talked about, or the UGC I talked about last time. But failure's been on my mind because I started something last year and it did not go how I expected. So I started thinking about failure and having failed something and the emotions that come with that, especially for me. It's how I feel inside, how I present myself outside with the idea of I failed this. But then I started to question that and to think, if I start something and it doesn't work, does that mean it failed? So I looked up the definition of failure, and one of the definitions says a person or thing that proves unsuccessful. And this is the definition that I think I've been using in my own head about everything. If something doesn't succeed, I call it a failure. But what I noticed was how quickly my mind went from this didn't work to I'm a failure because it didn't work, which those are two completely different sentences of this didn't work and I'm a failure. So when I was going to school, I was studying psychology. So I really like psychology and the study of people and the study of your brain and your mind. And there's one psychological concept called global labeling. It's when one event is turned into a label about who you are as a person. If something didn't work, that's an event. But when we turn that into I'm a failure, that's a completely different kind of statement because something can fail without me being a failure. So I started to think how quickly I turned from one unsuccessful outcome into what that means and what I make that mean about me as a person. And then to think, what does success even mean? Because the definition is a person or thing that proves unsuccessful. Because something can be unsuccessful in its intended outcome without meaning the entire effort was wasted. The definition of failure focuses on outcome, where learning focuses on process. So then I started thinking, why do our brains automatically go there? Why do our brains automatically go from one thought to one extreme about what we make it mean about ourselves, about me as a person? So I started to think about the conditioning that I've had, even as a child, way back when I was in grade school or in school, period. And it's the grade system, the way that the school tells you, hey, you passed this class, or hey, you failed this class. You either passed the class or you failed it. And then even in the workplace, there's profit and loss. You either had profit or you had loss, and you have the profit loss statement. So we're told, even as kids, hey, you passed it or you failed it and you didn't pass the class. Or hey, there's a profit, you had profit, or there's loss where you lost money. So there's one extreme or the other. So we grew up thinking we're being graded on outcomes. Just like the definition of failure focuses on outcome. We grew up being graded or taught or in our minds that, hey, our outcome determines our failure. So it's pretty easy to start thinking whatever it is the outcome is, it determines what our ability is to do it or that we fail or not fail at it. So I wanted to share an example that I've been thinking about a lot lately. It's what made me thinking about failure and how we fail at something from what I started last year that didn't work out how I expected it to work out. So my husband has his company, and one thing that I'm really good at and I find that I do well is running books and being able to keep track of expenses and being able to run how a company is structured. And I get that a lot from my dad, from what I learned from him about just money management and things in general. And what I did for a couple of different jobs for work was running their books, running their finances, learning about finances, learning about QuickBooks and all of that I learned in some of my jobs. And so that's something that I've done really well. So I wanted to help my husband with the company that he has and that he had started on his own last year to be able to run the books, to be able to track projects, do all these things that I enjoy doing as far as seeing outcomes, seeing different things, and also knowing that this isn't one of my husband's strengths to do it. So I thought, hey, if I, do this, then it would take some of the stress off of him. It would take some things off his shoulders to be able to focus on other things. So that's what I started to do, was to step in to help him with that. And I've done this many years before, even when he wasn't on his own with his own company, is to keep track of his books, to keep track of the projects and things as best as I could with what I had. But that's what I ran into, was what expected to happen was I was going to be able to run this for him. I was going to take all the weight off his shoulders. I was going to be able to, we'd be able to track projects. We'd be able to see the money that came in, the money that came out, all of that, as far as the projects go, as far as the money and finances and the scope of it. So it didn't exactly turn out how I expected it to turn out. So it was in March, really, is when he got projects and when he started on landscaping again. I did well from March until the middle to end of May, because in the middle of the end of May, that's when my kids were all out of school. So I had my kids home after that and for the summer. That was a big challenge for me, trying to juggle, hey, I want to do this and I want to help. I've said that I was going to help and do that. And then, hey, my kids are now all home all day long. And so I noticed that when I tried to do things for work, when I tried to even sit down to open up QuickBooks and start inputting and filing and doing all that my kids would come and they would need something or they would interrupt me. And the way I work is I focus, and with distractions, it's really hard for me to get back on schedule, get back on what I'm doing, get back on task. When I was getting distracted, I would realize, hey, I'm getting upset at my kids because I'm trying to focus, they're bugging me, and yet they're home from school all day. There was no way I was going to get quiet time other than if I put on a show for the kids, which is my favorite thing to do. And doing that multiple times a week wasn't what I wanted to be and the way I wanted to raise my kids. So for me personally, and the way I wanted to run my household, that wasn't really an option. So I noticed with that I just couldn't do it. I was like, I can't do this anymore. It's affecting my relationship with the kids. It's affecting the way that I show up for them and the kind of mom that I want to be. And so it was, I can't do this right now. In the season that I'm at in life the literal season of summer, but also with little kids, I decided I can't do this. It's not something that I want to sacrifice. It was, which sacrifice am I willing to do? Sacrifice the way I show up for my kids, or sacrifice I can't continue to do this on the side. And there was more that went into it than just my kids or doing that, because there were systems and different things that weren't working how I expected them to. For the longest time, it's been a year now almost, but I started to say to myself that I'm a failure and that I failed at the company and I failed at doing what I said I was going to do. But lately, I've started to think about it in a different way and to understand about how I view failure. And I started looking at the definition of failure. And like I said earlier, definition of failure focuses entirely on the outcome. Something either succeeds or it doesn't. So I started thinking about, okay, how can I think about this differently? How can I think about either you failed or you didn't? You passed your class, you didn't pass your class. You had profits, you had losses. So I started thinking about athletes and how after the game, especially after a loss, that they would review the tape to see what went well and worked and what didn't work or didn't go very well. So then I thought about scientists and how they try experiments. And they say, oh, we tried this experiment and it didn't work. We tried this experiment and it didn't work. And they try experiment after experiment after experiment. And they don't call it failure. They call it data. They collect the data from whatever it is that they were doing and to say, hey, this is what we learned. This is what we need to change and tweak and do different so that we can try to achieve what we're trying to achieve. And that's the process that they're going through in order to get to where they want to be or what they want to create or whatever it is. And the same with writers. They write draft after draft after draft. Throw it away, throw it away, throw it away. They have hundreds of drafts that they throw away, and they don't say, oh, all those drafts were failures. I failed on all those drafts. But no, they went through a process of refining, of saying, this didn't work. I didn't like this, or I wanted to do this differently. And so they changed it a little bit, and they changed. They went through this process in order to come up with the book that they wanted to write. And sometimes they start a draft, and sometimes you start something, and it ends up completely different. And they wouldn't say then, oh, this is a failure of a book because it didn't end up how I wanted it to start. It's no, this is something I'm proud of. This is something I did. All those drafts were just the process they needed to go through in order to have the book that they needed to have. But sometimes in my own personal life, I found that I often turn outcomes into identity judgment, where this is my identity now, I'm a failure. And yes, the writer eventually wrote a book, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes you do a bunch of drafts and you never come up with a book. Sometimes the scientists never can get the experiment, or they can never come up with a cure. They never can come up with what they're trying to come up with, but they're still learning, they're still growing, they're still in the process of trying. So what I've been noticing about that is the thing that happened, the company, me running the books, is actually very simple. Something didn't work the way I expected it to work. But the meaning that I've attached to that now becomes something much bigger. So I've tried starting to think about, what data am I collecting when I've tried things? How has that data shaped how I view myself, or even sometimes how I view others? When something doesn't work, people often label it as failure. Sometimes even people will directly say that to you. You failed at this. You failed at this. I've been trying to understand the difference between an outcome that doesn't work and then what that means about me as a person. So I keep coming back to the question that I started with, is if I try something and it doesn't work, does that make me a failure? And then I try to challenge that thought with other thoughts of, maybe trying something and it doesn't work is still valuable. Maybe the very act of trying changes what you understand about yourself. And maybe success isn't only defined by what the outcome is. So I'm starting to wonder if maybe trying something and discovering, hey, this didn't work. This wasn't how I expected. This wasn't what I wanted. And this wasn't what I planned for. When I started this, taking that first step, starting something, even though you don't know the ending, even though you don't know what this is going to lead to, if it's going to lead to anything, when it doesn't lead to anything, or when it doesn't lead to what you thought it would be, or you start it and you say, I don't like this, or this isn't what I wanted, that still might lead you or move you forward in ways that you couldn't even see before. So these are still questions that I'm trying to ponder myself. If trying something and discovering it doesn't work or doesn't turn out how you wanted it to or expected it to, and by the very act of the process that you go through, even on a business that doesn't work, a book that was written and they went through all these drafts and they went through the process of doing it and they actually wrote the book and they're proud of it, but maybe that book doesn't sell. And maybe they think, I didn't do well. I failed because my book didn't sell, even after going through the process. But they can see and they can discover about themselves what they learned in the process of doing what they wanted to do or doing what they tried to do or taking that first step, and not saying, okay, this didn't work. This book might have failed, but seeing what that means to you or what it doesn't mean or what you shouldn't make it mean about yourself as a person. So learning in real time doesn't mean I always get it right or that I even understand everything, but just what I'm trying to understand, what I'm trying to understand about myself, about the experiences that I have, and to grow and learn through them, through the process of them, not taking an outcome and making that mean something about myself. And maybe what I call failure, or what I view I failed at something, are actually the moments where I learn the most about myself and what I can handle and what I am capable of and what I can do. And just through the process of that, to say, maybe that didn't work. That wasn't how I expected. That's not what I wanted, but I did it, but I tried. I didn't know what the outcome was. I took that first step, and maybe I don't even like what I ended up with. Or maybe I really wanted this to work and it didn't. But hey, now I've already been through this process one time before. I already started something. I already started when I wasn't ready. I already started by taking the first smallest step that I could. I can do that again. And I've grown resilient in my own self to say, now I want to do these things. Maybe the season of life has changed a little bit. Maybe myself has changed, or the way that I view myself has changed. Because sometimes maybe the most valuable part of trying isn't whether it works or it doesn't work. It's that trying leads to that process, leads to that becoming, leads to that learning, leads to that I never knew I could do this. And I did it. I tried. I invested myself in it. And that's okay if it didn't work how I expected. That's okay if it didn't turn out how I wanted it to. But I'm not going to make that mean anything about who I am as a person, but to say, this is who I want to be. This is what I want to look back on this and say, this is what I want to learn from this. This is how I want to grow from these so-called failures. So I know this is a lot heavier than I might have initially thought that this episode was going to go, but it's these internal thoughts, these internal emotions, these internal feelings that I've been having about failure, about what I make that mean about myself and what I shouldn't make it mean about myself, and to be okay and confident in myself to know the outcome versus the process of learning, the process of growing. And in the process, yes, there might be things that don't work. There might be things that you can say fail, but that's what the process is. That's how you learn, and that's how you get back up and keep going. And I'm trying not to let it mean anything about myself as a person. So if you've struggled also with the thought of failure, or that you're a failure, or that you let the outcome determine how you view yourself. I would love to hear any of your experiences or stories or thoughts on that. And I'll see you guys next week.